Let me tell you something that most people are getting completely wrong about what just happened between China and Iran. The news came through quiet diplomatic channels. No press conference, no dramatic announcement. Just a technical agreement on enhanced border security cooperation along the Wakhan corridor and the broader eastern frontier. On the surface, it sounds bureaucratic, almost boring. Two neighboring countries coordinating on border management. Why would anyone care? But here's where it gets interesting. And honestly, this development flipped my entire understanding of how containment actually works in the 21st century. Because what China just did was not about stopping smugglers or managing migration flows. What China just did was eliminate the last theoretical avenue through which American military pressure could reach Iran from an unexpected direction. And the fact that Washington has said absolutely nothing about this, not a statement from the State Department, not a background briefing to friendly journalists, not even a Twitter thread from some assistant undersecretary, that silence is not indifference. That silence is the sound of strategic options narrowing in real time. To understand why this matters so much, you have to think about what encirclement actually represents in modern strategic competition. We talk about containment like it's a binary condition. You are either contained or you are not. But the reality is far more granular than that. Containment is about closing off options, systematically reducing the number of directions from which your opponent can be pressured, attacked, supplied, or reinforced. It is about creating a situation where every possible move your adversary makes can be anticipated, monitored, and countered because you control the geography around them. The framework here is what strategic planners call perimeter control, and it has deep historical roots. Think about how Rome dealt with Carthage. Rome did not defeat Carthage in a single decisive battle and walk away. Rome spent decades methodically stripping away Carthage's allies, controlling the sea lanes, occupying strategic islands until Carthage existed on a map but had no freedom of action whatsoever. When the final war came, Carthage was already strangled. The actual destruction was just formalizing what the strategic map had already decided. Now fast forward about 2,000 years to today. Iran sits in the middle of one of the most contested regions on Earth. To the west, Iraq, barely stable, filled with American influence and Iranian proxies fighting for control. To the south, the Persian Gulf, dominated by American naval power and Gulf Arab states that view Iran as an existential threat. To the north, the Caucasus and Central Asia, regions where Russian and Turkish influence compete, but where Iran has historically maintained some diplomatic maneuvering room. And to the east, Afghanistan and Pakistan, chaotic border regions that have traditionally represented Iran's most vulnerable frontier, but also paradoxically, its least constrained direction. That eastern border has always been the wild card in any scenario where pressure on Iran escalates to direct confrontation. Here is why that eastern frontier mattered so much in American contingency planning. And I want to be very specific here because the details reveal the logic. If the United States ever moved toward direct military confrontation with Iran, every Western and Southern approach is a nightmare. Invasion through Iraq means fighting through territory where Iranian-aligned militias are dug in, where supply lines stretch across hostile desert, where every city becomes a potential Fallujah. Naval blockade in the Persian Gulf puts 20% of global oil supply at immediate risk and threatens American ships with swarm attacks from fast boats, anti-ship missiles fired from mountainous coastline, and mines in shallow choke points. Air campaigns face sophisticated air defense networks, hardened underground facilities, and the very real risk that Iran responds by turning the entire region into a multi-front war, activating Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq and Syria, proxies in Yemen. All of those approaches are possible, but none of them are clean, and none of them are fast. But the Eastern approach, that was different. Afghanistan, after 20 years of American presence, still had residual infrastructure, air bases that could theoretically be reactivated, intelligence networks that knew the terrain. Pakistan, historically complicated in its relationship with both America and Iran, presented potential leverage points. And crucially, that eastern frontier was where Iran was least prepared for sustained pressure, where its defensive posture was oriented toward internal security threats like drug smuggling and separatist movements rather than great power military operations. Military planners use a general rule of thumb. You want to attack from the direction your enemy least expects and is least prepared to defend. The eastern border was not where Iran expected American power to manifest. Now layer on top of that the question of what China just accomplished with this agreement. The technical language talks about joint border patrols, information sharing on cross-border movements, coordinated infrastructure development in the border regions. But strip away the diplomatic phrasing, and what you are looking at is China extending its security perimeter to include the Iranian frontier. Chinese border forces, Chinese surveillance technology, Chinese logistical infrastructure now operating in a region that was previously outside Beijing's direct control. This is not about helping Iran catch drug runners. This is about Beijing ensuring that no external actor can use that frontier as a staging ground for operations against a strategic partner. And let us be very clear about what strategic partner means in this context. China and Iran signed a 25-year cooperation agreement in 2021, $400 billion in planned Chinese investment in Iranian infrastructure, energy, telecommunications. Iran provides China with oil at discounted rates, pays in yuan rather than dollars, and offers Beijing a critical node in its belt and road networks connecting to the Middle East and Africa. For China, Iran is not just another trading partner. Iran is a critical piece in the architecture of a post-American regional order. If Iran falls, if Iran gets destabilized, if Iran becomes a client state of Washington again, like it was before 1979, then China's entire western flank becomes vulnerable to American pressure. So, when China seals that eastern border, what Beijing is communicating is very simple. Iran's strategic independence is now a core Chinese interest, and we will use our proximity, our resources, and our influence to ensure that no one can pressure Iran from directions we can control. Think about what that means for American strategic planners sitting in the Pentagon right now. Every scenario they have gamed out for increasing pressure on Iran just got significantly more complicated. You cannot stage operations through Afghanistan when China is monitoring and potentially interdicting every movement along that border. You cannot count on using Pakistan as a leverage point when Pakistan is increasingly dependent on Chinese investment and sees Beijing as a more reliable partner than Washington. You cannot assume that Iran will remain geographically isolated when the second largest economy in the world has just extended a security guarantee through infrastructure and presence. Here is the second thing to understand, and this is where it gets genuinely complicated. The American silence on this development is not confusion. Washington knows exactly what just happened. The silence is strategic paralysis. Because what can America actually say? If the United States formally objects to a border security agreement between two sovereign nations, it tacitly admits that American strategy relied on keeping that border vulnerable. It exposes the containment architecture in a way that makes it harder to maintain. If America does nothing and says nothing, it preserves deniability but concedes the strategic ground. This is the bind that great powers fall into when their dominance begins to erode, not through dramatic military defeat, but through accumulating constraints. Every option available has costs that previous generations of policymakers never had to calculate, and the costs keep rising. Let me walk you through exactly how this changes the escalation mathematics, because the implications cascade in ways that most analysis is missing completely. Start at the immediate tactical level. Iran now has strategic depth to its east that it did not possess 6 months ago. If conflict erupts, Iran can move resources, reposition assets, disperse critical infrastructure toward the eastern regions with reasonable confidence that those areas will not become active fronts. That flexibility matters enormously in a country that is 6 million square kilometers with 85 million citizens spread across diverse terrain. Containment works when you can pressure all sides simultaneously, when your opponent has no safe rear area, no sanctuary to regroup and resupply. China just created that sanctuary. Iranian military planners are already recalculating how much force they need to keep on the eastern frontier versus how much they can redirect to western and southern defensive preparations. Now, extend that to the regional level, and here is where the feedback loops start compounding. Every neighbor watching this understands the signal Beijing just sent. If you align with Iran, if you resist American pressure, China will provide the strategic support necessary to survive. If you align with Washington, you are betting that American commitment will outlast Chinese patience and resources, and that bet is looking increasingly uncertain. Saudi Arabia, which spent decades as America's closest Arab ally, just reopened diplomatic relations with Iran through Chinese mediation. The United Arab Emirates is hedging, maintaining ties with Washington while expanding economic relationships with Beijing and Tehran. Turkey, a NATO member, is buying Russian weapons and exploring energy partnerships with Iran despite American sanctions. These are not random bilateral decisions. These are responses to a shifting strategic map where the assumption that America can impose costs without facing costs itself is breaking down. The perimeter that once contained Iran is developing gaps, and those gaps are widening because regional actors are making rational calculations about where power is flowing and where it is receding. Take it to the global economic level, because this is where the mechanisms get systemic. The petrodollar system, the architecture that has structured global oil trade since the 1970s, depends on a very specific set of conditions. Oil producers sell in dollars, which creates global demand for American currency, which allows the United States to run massive budget deficits, because the world needs dollars to buy energy. That demand for dollars funds American military spending, which protects the oil trade, which reinforces the dollar's dominance. The system is circular and self-reinforcing until one of the links breaks. Iran selling oil to China in yuan does not break the system overnight, but it creates an alternative pathway. Other producers start asking, if Iran can sell in yuan and China will buy in yuan, why are we absorbing currency risk and sanctions exposure by insisting on dollar transactions? The moment Saudi Arabia, Russia, Venezuela, or other major producers start accepting payment in alternative currencies at scale, the demand for dollars decreases. When demand for dollars decreases, the cost of American debt rises. When debt costs rise, the budget available for military spending faces pressure. When military spending faces constraints, the ability to project power globally weakens. When power projection weakens, the security guarantees that kept the oil trade flowing in dollars become less credible. The cycle reverses. And China sealing Iran's eastern border is not directly about oil pricing, but it absolutely accelerates this process because it demonstrates that China can provide security guarantees that rival American commitments, which makes the transition to alternative currencies less risky for producers considering the shift. Finally, zoom out to the structural level, to the underlying order that has organized global politics for decades. The post-Cold War system was built on a simple assumption. American military dominance was so overwhelming that challenging it was irrational. Countries could resist at the margins. They could pursue regional ambitions. They could even acquire nuclear weapons as a survival guarantee. But they could not fundamentally reshape the strategic map because American power could be brought to bear anywhere on Earth with speed and scale that no other actor could match. That assumption is what made containment work. You threaten consequences, and because your opponent believes you can deliver those consequences, they modify their behavior. But belief in American capability to deliver consequences requires demonstrating that capability periodically. It requires showing that when you draw a red line, crossing it produces the threatened result. And over the last 2 decades, America has drawn many red lines that got crossed without producing the threatened consequences. Syria used chemical weapons after Obama said that would trigger intervention. It did not. Iran exceeded nuclear enrichment limits that were supposed to trigger snapback sanctions. The sanctions came, Iran adapted. Russia took Crimea despite warnings. Ukraine got some weapons, Russia kept Crimea. China built military installations on disputed islands despite American freedom of navigation operations. The installations are still there, more fortified than ever. Each time a red line gets crossed without consequence, the credibility of the next red line diminishes. And China sealing Iran's eastern border without American response is another one of those moments. It is not a red line that Washington explicitly drew, but the strategic logic was implicit. Iran remains isolated, Iran remains containable, and external powers do not extend security guarantees that interfere with American options. That implicit understanding just got violated, and the silence from Washington communicates clearly that America either cannot or will not contest this development. Regional powers are watching. When the next crisis comes, when the next red line gets drawn, they will remember that China moved into Iran's strategic space and nothing happened. These trends are not happening in separate boxes. They interact. Economic competition generates political tension. Political tension makes security cooperation harder. Harder security cooperation makes economic decoupling more likely. Economic decoupling increases pressure on the dollar system. Pressure on the dollar system reduces fiscal flexibility. Reduced fiscal flexibility constrains military spending. Constrained military spending limits power projection. Limited power projection reduces the credibility of security guarantees. Reduced credibility encourages regional powers to seek alternative partnerships. Alternative partnerships create new facts on the ground, like Chinese forces securing Iranian borders. And the cycle reinforces itself, each iteration tightening the constraints on American strategic freedom. So, when you zoom all the way out and look at the complete picture, what you see is not a chaotic and unpredictable situation. What you see is a very deliberate squeeze, a squeeze built not through a single dramatic confrontation, but through patient accumulation of small shifts that add up to structural transformation. China is not trying to defeat American power in a direct conflict. China is trying to make American power irrelevant in regions where Beijing has vital interests by creating facts on the ground that would be extraordinarily costly to reverse. Sealing Iran's eastern border is one fact. Building ports across the Indian Ocean is another. Extending loans to countries trapped in debt is another. Every initiative is defensible on its own terms: border security, infrastructure development, economic cooperation. But together, they form a perimeter that insulates China's strategic interests from American pressure. The real question is not whether America can respond to this specific development. The question is whether Washington possesses the strategic patience, the fiscal resources, the domestic political cohesion, and the allied coordination to contest this pattern across dozens of countries and multiple regions simultaneously. Because that is what contesting it requires. You cannot just reverse the Iran border agreement in isolation. You would need to offer Pakistan a better deal than China is offering. You would need to stabilize Afghanistan in ways that 20 years of direct occupation did not achieve. You would need to provide Iran with a reason to reject Chinese partnership, which means either accepting Iran back into the international system on terms Tehran finds acceptable or increasing pressure to levels that risk regional war. Every option has costs that compound with every other front where American resources are committed. Europe needs support to counter Russia. Asia needs reassurance about China. The Middle East needs stabilization. Africa is becoming a Chinese sphere of influence. Latin America is drifting. And the federal government is carrying $34 trillion in debt while domestic infrastructure crumbles and political polarization makes long-term strategic commitments nearly impossible to sustain. This is not about one border agreement. This is about what happens when an empire that structured its entire global position around unchallenged dominance faces sustained, patient, multidimensional competition from a peer power that learned from American mistakes and is exploiting American overextension. Rome did not fall because Carthage beat them. Rome fell because the cost of maintaining the perimeter exceeded the resources the system could generate. And when the perimeter started contracting, the contraction accelerated. We are watching that acceleration now. It is not dramatic. It is incremental. But incremental changes compound, and compounding changes become irreversible before the institutions designed to respond can adapt. The next time you hear about Chinese infrastructure projects in Central Asia, or yuan-denominated oil transactions, or security partnerships between Beijing and countries America once considered within its sphere of influence, try holding all of these things together in the same frame, because they are not separate stories. They are different angles on the same story. And that story is about how global power shifts not through war, but through the patient construction of alternative architectures that make the old order increasingly expensive to maintain. America's silence on the Iran border development is not a communication failure. It is the sound of options narrowing, of strategic freedom contracting, of a system that once set the rules now discovering that the rules are changing, and the mechanisms to change them back are not responding the way they used to. Empires do not collapse overnight. They erode. And right now, the conditions for that erosion are assembling with remarkable speed.